Hello and welcome to lesson 8.4A. I've entitled this video, The Early Stages of the War. This video is going to cover pages 513 to 516. The course of war. The North and South had different strategies for victory. The Union planned an aggressive campaign against the South. The South, meanwhile, planned to hold tight until the North lost the will to fight. How did the strategies of the North and South differ? The Union strategy. First, the Union planned to use its navy to blockade southern ports. This would cut off the South's supply of manufactured goods from Europe and its ability to earn money from cotton exports. So question number one, what is a blockade? A blockade is when you use ships to block an area, like a country, from getting things in or out. So this hurts their chances of getting trade goods from, in this case, from Europe. And secondly, it hurts their chances of making money from exports. Question number two, what would be the two benefits of using a naval blockade against the Confederacy during the Civil War? Well, it would stop European manufactured goods from getting into the Confederacy, and it would stop cotton exports from getting out of the Confederacy. In the East, Union generals aimed to seize Richmond, Virginia, shown here, about 100 miles away from the Union capital of Washington, D.C. They thought that might end the war quickly by capturing the Confederate government. So question number three, the second strategy was to capture the Confederate capital. What city was the Confederate capital? Richmond, Virginia. In the West, the Union planned to seize control of the Mississippi River. This would prevent the South from using the river to supply its troops. It would also separate Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy. So this was called the Anaconda Plan. This was a plan proposed by Winfield Scott, who was a general for the North, and he said early on in the war it was going to be a long war, which a lot of people were skeptic about. But he said, yeah, it's going to be a long war, and one of the ways we're going to win is we're going to put in this Anaconda Plan. We're going to blockade the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to split the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two, and we're going to squeeze them like an anaconda. So number five, the two benefits of taking complete control of the Mississippi River during the war. Number one, it would prevent the South from using the river to supply its troops. And secondly, it would split the Confederacy in two, with Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas split from the rest of the Confederacy. Why that would be a big deal also is because Texas provided a lot of the meat for the Confederacy with all the longhorns and cattle they had there. The Confederate strategy. The South strategy was simpler. The Confederate Army would fight a defensive war until Northerners tired of fighting. If the war became unpopular in the North, President Lincoln would have to stop the war and recognize the South's independence. Question number six. Why was the South hoping that the North would get tired of fighting the Civil War? Well, because we live in a democracy. When we elect our presidents, the concept was if the war drug on, that eventually in the next election, that Americans would say, we don't want President Lincoln. Or even before the election, the American people might say, President Lincoln put a stop to this. We no longer want to fight the South. Remember, this was a war we were fighting to bring the South back into our country again. So we, here in the North, were fighting a war to bring somebody back in that didn't want to be with us. So that kind of war might be a little bit more unpopular than in the South when they were fighting literally for their homes and their way of life. The Confederacy counted on European money and supplies. Southern cotton was important to the textile mills of England and other countries. Southerners thought that Europeans would recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation and that the South could continue to sell them cotton. Remember, King Cotton. Question 7. Why were Southerners confident that Europe would recognize the Confederacy as an independent country? The South believed that Europe, especially Britain, relied so much on their cotton that they would be forced to recognize the Confederacy because they would continue to want that cotton to come into their factories. One thing that did happen during the Civil War is Britain ended up getting cotton from other places in the world, especially from Egypt, and this was a surprise to the Confederacy. They did not see that coming. Early battles. Forward to Richmond! Forward to Richmond! Every day, for more than a month, the influential New York Tribune blazed this war cry across its front page. The Union Army seemed reluctant to go on the offensive, however. At last, 3 months after the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln responded to public pressure and ordered an attack. Stonewall Jackson makes a stand at Bull Run. The Confederate Army was camped just 30 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., and you can see that right there. There's the location of the Battle of Bull Run. Notice how close it is to Washington, D.C., very close. On July 21st, 1861, Union troops set out from the nation's capital to attack the rebel forces. Hundreds of Washingtonians, in a festive mood, rode out along with the army to watch the battle. Many thought the Union Army would crush the Confederates. In fact, I show you a picture here of people who were almost engaged in like a picnic style. Remember, this was before the internet and before TV, so for a lot of these people, this was entertainment. They wanted to see the Union Army crush those stupid Confederates and bring them back into the country and end the war in one swift battle. So question 8, why do you think hundreds of Washingtonians traveled to see the first Battle of Bull Run? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, boredom, or they wanted to see an exciting battle. This would be, for some of them, entertainment. And secondly, there was almost an overconfidence that the Union Army was going to crush the Confederates. They were going to be in for a surprise, by the way. Spoiler alert. The Union troops had not gone far when they encountered Confederate troops near a small stream known as Bull Run, close by the town of Manassas, Virginia. And the generals at this battle would be Irwin McDonald for the Union Army and P.G.T. Beauregard for the Confederates. And interesting, in the Civil War, many times the North would name a battle after nearby rivers or streams, and the South would name the battles often by local farms or towns. So in the South, they called this the Battle of Manassas. In the North, this was called the Battle of Bull Run. And since we won the Civil War, we get to name the battles. At first, Union forces succeeded in breaking up Confederate battle lines. "The war is over," yelled some soldiers from Massachusetts, but General Thomas Jackson rallied the Virginia troops on a nearby hill. One soldier says to General Jackson, "The enemy are driving us." And General Jackson responds, "Then, sir, we will give them the bayonets." And then from afar, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Follow me." So, General Thomas Jackson rallied the Virginia troops on a nearby hill. From that day on, the general was known as Stonewall Jackson. Historians consider him one of the most gifted tactical commanders in the Civil War. Question 9. How did Confederate General Thomas Jackson impact the first Battle of Bull Run? Well, for a moment it looked like the Union was going to win the battle, but General Thomas Stonewall Jackson rallied his men, got them to stop fleeing, held their ground, and in the end, turned the tide of the Battle of Bull Run. And question 10, because of this, he received the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Cool name. Question 11, what do historians think about General Stonewall Jackson's ability as a general? He is considered to be one of the most gifted generals of the Civil War. In the end, it was the Union troops who panicked and ran. Off they went, reported one observer, across fields, toward the woods, anywhere, everywhere, to escape. The Battle of Bull Run, also referred to as the Battle of Manassas by the Confederates, showed how badly both Union and Confederate soldiers needed training. It also proved that the Confederate Army could stand up to the Union, meaning the war would be long and bloody. So question number 12, which side ended up panicking and fleeing the first Battle of Bull Run? The Union troops. Not to mention some of those picnickers were also in a panic as they fled back to Washington. Question 13, what were the two things both sides learned about the Civil War after the first Battle of Bull Run? Well, number one, it showed how badly both sides needed training. Number one, the Union troops were fleeing or retreating from the battlefield. They were throwing their knapsacks and their guns off of their bodies as they ran towards Washington. And number two, it also showed how the Confederate soldiers needed training because instead of pursuing the Union soldiers, they stopped to pick up all the things the Union soldiers were dropping because they needed supplies. So both sides realized they needed training. And then it also showed that this war was not going to be over by one battle. This was going to be a long and bloody war. The Union Army under George McClellan. Northerners were shocked by the disaster at Bull Run. Almost immediately, President Lincoln appointed General George McClellan, shown here, as commander of the Union Army of the East, known as the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a superb organizer who transformed inexperienced recruits into battle-ready soldiers. Question number 16. What was Union General George McClellan really good at? What was his strength? He was really good at organizing the troops and getting them ready to fight. That was his strength. He was a superb organizer. And I skipped number 15. What name was given to the Union Army in the East? It was also called the Army of the Potomac, named after the Potomac River, which is right there by Washington, D.C. McClellan, however, was very cautious. Newspapers reported all quiet along the Potomac, so often that the phrase became a national joke, not to mention it became a song. President Lincoln lost patience. If General McClellan does not want to use the army, the president snapped, I would like to borrow it. Question number 17. What was a major weakness of Union General George McClellan? While he was a superb organizer, which was a strength, his problem was he didn't want to lose troops. He did not want to be aggressive. He was too cautious. He had the numbers. He had the superior amount of troops, and yet he was afraid to use those numbers, realizing that it would cost lives. Well, the point of war is to kill more of the other side than they kill of yours. And General McClellan sometimes struggled with having the thought of losing his own men, which was the point of the Civil War. Number 18, what did President Lincoln mean when he said, if General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it? What he meant by that is, hey, George McClellan, I made you the general for a reason, to go fight battles, not to sit back in Washington and train. We get it. The troops are ready, but you need to actually take them out to fight. At last, in March 1862, McClellan and most of his troops left Washington. They sailed down the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay and landed south of Richmond on the Virginia Peninsula, and you can see that pictured here. McClellan slowly moved toward the Confederate capital, and you can see that movement there. General Lee launched a series of counterattacks. At the same time, Lee sent Jackson north to threaten Washington, D.C. Lincoln was forced to retain troops in Washington to defend the capital. This prevented him from sending reinforcements to help McClellan. Cautious as usual, McClellan abandoned the attack and retreated. The Peninsula Campaign, as it became known, had failed. So question number 19. What were a couple of reasons why the Peninsula Campaign of 1862 failed for the Union? Well, number one, Lee was smart. He sent General Stonewall Jackson up north to make sure that Lincoln couldn't send reinforcements to help McClellan. And then secondly, once again, McClellan was too cautious and he retreated and didn't push the attack. So the attack on the Peninsula Campaign failed. The blockade and the ironclads. Early in the war, Union ships blockaded southern ports. Because the South had few factories, it depended on imports for manufactured goods, such as weapons. A blockade could cripple the Confederate war effort. At first, some small, fast ships, shown here, slipped through the blockade. These blockade runners brought everything from matches to guns to the Confederacy. In time, however, the blockade became more effective. Trade through southern ports dropped by more than 90%. The South desperately needed to break the Union blockade. One method it tried was the ironclad ship. Clad means clothed or covered. Ironclad ships were covered with iron for protection. Question 20. What were blockade runners trying to do during the Civil War? They were trying to get goods from the European countries, especially Britain, get those goods to the South because now the North wasn't trading with the South, so they needed those goods from other places. So they were trying to basically negate or get around the blockade. 22. What technological change in naval ships did the South try so they could break the blockade? They tried covering their ships in iron, ironclad ships. Confederates modified an abandoned Union warship, the USS Merrimac. They covered it with iron plates and renamed it the Virginia. On its first day out in March 1862, the Virginia demonstrated the advantages of ironclads. It destroyed 2 Union ships and drove 3 more aground. Union cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the Virginia's metal skin. The Union countered with its own ironclad, the Monitor. Soon the 2 ships clashed near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. This was the first time 2 ironclad warships battled one another. Despite an exhausting battle, neither vessel seriously damaged the other, and both withdrew. 2 months later, Confederates had to sink the Virginia when the Union captured Norfolk. So question number 23, what was the point of making an ironclad ship? Well, the point was, if you made your ship covered with iron, then cannonballs wouldn't be able to penetrate the wood, and it would basically just bounce off and your ship would not be damaged. Question 24. Even though the battle between the Merrimac, or the Virginia, and the Monitor was a draw, what was the importance of the battle? Well, what it showed is the advances in technology when it came to the military fighting. The use of wooden ships at this point, people realized that was a thing of the past, and technology advanced to the ships that were made of more modern materials like iron. And so this was an advancement in military technology, and that of course would continue on throughout the late 1800s and even until World War I, where metal ships were used again. 25. One of the 3 Union strategies for winning the Civil War was using a blockade against the Confederacy. Was the Union able to accomplish this strategy during the Civil War? It sure was, as we're going to see here. As ironclad ships became a standard part of naval forces, they changed naval warfare. The Union built 50 more ironclads during the Civil War and continued to build them for decades after. Other nations built them as well. They were later used in World War I. Because of the North's ironclads, the South was never again able to mount a serious attack against the Union Navy. The Union blockade held throughout the war. So of the 3 strategies for winning the Civil War, blockade the South, take the Mississippi River, and capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, goal number 1 was accomplished in the Civil War. We were able to successfully blockade the South throughout the Civil War. Well, thank you for watching. Before we go, I do have kind of a funny story, a little funny, I suppose. A letter home. A young soldier left home to join the army. He told his girlfriend that he would write every day. After about 6 months, he received a letter from his girlfriend that she was marrying someone else. He wrote home to his family to find out who she married. The family wrote back and told him it was the mailman. Oh my. Thank you and have a nice day.